to do the update on the chapter that we wrote like 3 years, 4 years ago. And I'm really happy to be sharing this. We hope to make this a really lively event with conversation with the panelists, and hopefully also your voice in the chat and through Twitter and in a Google Doc that we will share a link in the chat and on Twitter soon. Basically, the goal of the event is to discuss a little bit on how has or what progress has happened recently on the use of data for accountability. So we will have a really good and awesome roundup of experts talking. We have Keziah, Munyao, Natalia, Carfi, Bence, Tóth, and Courtney Tolmie. I will be introducing them a little bit more on when they talk. And I will start with really short presentation about some trends that have been changing in these recent years. But I won't go into that much detail because we have our experts and the goal is to make it part of the conversation. There's one thing, and is that your input in the chat, in the Google Doc, in Twitter, in any part will be really useful for the data of the chapter and the whole review of the state of open data. So please do share your ideas. We want to hear your voice and get your thoughts and opinions. So I'm going to start with the presentation. Okay, 1 second. Great. So basically, I want to cover 3 things. One is just a quick recap or where we were on 2019 when we wrote the chapter, the state of open data. So what were kind of the takeaways at that point when the open data movement had 10 years going on. Then talk a little, like highlight some main trends and some ideas on the main trends that we're seeing. And then just a couple of reflections for ways forward. So I'll be doing that. So in terms of takeaways, what we have is that there is a wide range of organizations at the local and global level working on issues related to the use of open data for anti-corruption, be it in terms of increasing the availability of data, testing new ways for using the data to identify corruption. So there was at that point already a vibrant community working on this, and that community has remained vibrant and has expanded with some actors and specific sectors coming in. Then we have also had a common challenge across the organizations working on these issues, and is that the data availability was still low with some challenges. The use was not directly related to opening up information, and the impact has been and continues to be hard to assess. And the relationship between those 3 things is not straightforward. The focus at that point from most efforts was basically capacity building, the implementation of technical solutions, and there was some beginning to raise awareness about considering additional context factors that will require adapting the different technical solutions and efforts happening at the country and the global level. And one important thing is that the anti-corruption space and the conversation is also kind of young as the data for development space. So basically, there were still important conversations, and there are still important conversations happening in that space that need to be taken into account in the data for anti-corruption space. Cool. So that was the state of things 3 or 4 years ago. Now, some of the main trends that I'm going to highlight have to do with changes or not in terms of data availability and support for data use, in terms of anti-corruption approaches and evolution in that thinking. Other one in developing and testing specific methods for using data for anti-corruption. Another one is measuring the uptake and impact, and some changes in the context that obviously have an effect on the extent to which open data can be used for anti-corruption. I'll be covering these issues lightly because our experts are going to be deeper into these issues, and we're also going to have a conversation and take your questions and discuss those. So in terms of data availability and support for use, in general, what we're seeing is that progress remains on slow, publication partial, and there are setbacks and implementation gaps. Keziah will be talking more about the results from the Global Data Barometer, but what we're seeing is that although there is progress in some places, there are setbacks in others. And one thing that remains across the board is that the government's regulations, their international commitments are yet to be fully implemented. We're doing some additional research on that, but implementation gaps are an important thing and something that requires more work from the community. Another one is the increased salience of some thematic areas or specific approaches in thematic areas. So for instance, we saw in the last years a ton of work on land open data and the use of that data, issues around beneficial ownership, and those have gotten a lot of attention, and also some changes in extractives, be it due to the expansion of the EATI standard or other local and more like national practices for disclosing and promoting the use of that information to track the contribution to development and other interesting angles that the conversation has been evolving to. And we also see some progress on e-government and digitalization of processes in government, but there is still a way to go in there. In terms of the approaches and how approaches have evolved, there are many things that could be highlighted. I'm just gonna highlight four. One is that there has been an increased conversation between corruption and open data communities, which is something that we call for in the state of open data, and that seems to be happening. There is also an increased recognition of politically aware and systemic approaches, and this is happening across the development space and the open data space. So that is seeing or being shown in the practices related to the use of open data for anti-corruption. Issues like considering that a particular reform can have a significant effect in reducing one practice of corruption, but it might just change the dynamics of corrupt actors. So a call for understanding and addressing better issues related to how the systems and the local systems work and how we can try to shift incentives and political dynamics there. Another one has been a real strong strengthening of the data journalism efforts and approaches. We can see very important things, so like bringing context in. So journalists have taken the lead in bringing in other types of information, other types of narratives, other types of ways of using data to identify leads, then provide context to those leads and develop stories that have an impact and that can call the attention of the people involved. So that work has been really growing and really good. I think that there have been also progress in the storytelling and the visualizations that data journalists are using, and the tools, for instance, tools developed by OCCRP or others, or even at the national and local level, try to combine different types of methods like political analysis in a particular context to then use data to create the narratives and build the cases and investigations. That is something that has been evolving in a quite interesting way. And also the merging or consolidation to some government-led approaches, which are good. Like an example of that can be the Oceano platform by the General Controller in Colombia, that is currently kind of just digging into the whole ocean of data that is available to identify corruption lists and improve the way in which they target investigations. But one thing that is happening with some, if not most of those approaches, is that they are not necessarily open. There are examples like the Dosorro platform that are open, that enable other types of interaction, but that's not the rule. Then other programs have been developing and testing methods. We have seen some design and to some extent implementation of procurement analytics that have been like an area of good expansion and good improvement. There is also the continued and more realistic development of blockchain technologies for anti-corruption, kind of being more aware of the limitations of the technology and the and the potential and the limitations of applying it. So some interesting things happening around the use of that for identification and elections, for financial transactions, for records management in things like land, and for value chains with something that several extractive companies and organizations in the extractive sector are trying to address. And also continue testing of AI and other approaches, but they are still limited by the issues related to the availability of data. You can train the algorithm as much as the data that you have. So it has a lot of implications, a lot of ethical considerations, and a lot of limits that are placed on the methodologies for that. And then in terms of measuring uptake and impact, the challenges remain kind of the same as 3 years ago. There have been continued debates on where and how to understand and measure progress and impact. There are some progress in some of those conversations, but it's still a way to go. There are developments of methods for assessing progress and impact, and maybe here the biggest thing to highlight is the revamp or the launch of the global data barometer and all the different things that they are trying in terms of trying to improve how we see the system related to data and the results that that system is producing and how that is leading to some impact through use. And also increase efforts to account for political, institutional, and economic dynamics around corruption. And this is a shift that is happening mostly in the corruption specific space, with investigations that try to go deeper into the political dynamics and the way that specific corruption problems are playing out in practice. So then you can develop ways to use data to gather and use data to implement it. So that's a really interesting space for following the conversation. And then there are also some changes in context that have been happening recently. Two that are really connected are the COVID-19 pandemic, which had a good push for efforts to try to use technologies to fight corruption. Since we were all in lockdown, there were many things happening. So there have been efforts to try to use that as a way to improve the availability of data to some limited extent in most places, but with some good examples, but also have had bad kind of consequences, such as the increased tendency to close civic space, to reduce the space for civil society and journalists to operate. The COVID-19 was an excuse for doing that, and still we need to shift those dynamics. Other thing that is important to consider in the context and how it will and is affecting the data for anti-corruption space is the changes that are happening to donor priorities with an increased focus on localization of efforts, which can have an effect on open data, standards use, and other things. And also the increased call to get to some sector results or development results, have other types of results to show. And something also reasonably interesting is the evolution that is happening in approaches to data governance and the implication that that has for participation, for accountability, and for other types of relationship between government and civil society that at the end will lead any kind of investigation or result or data availability to action. Finally, some reflections on ways forward. One thing that is important across the board is closing implementation gaps, be it by improving how we demand data or how we get the data from the governments and how we keep pushing them to open and to share the information and to also collaborate with them to improve the ways in which data is open and the level of accomplishing the commitments and the regulations that they have in place. Another one is moving from or complementing the increase and really relevant work and investigations to achieving responses, be it in changes in sanctions, be it in changes in the systems and the prevention ways and the ways to prevent corruption, but actions from the government and from other relevant stakeholders and those engaged in corruption. So like really generating response through the use of data, working on capacities, but especially at the local level and those related to the support to data use at the local level, because the processes still happen, but we need to pay more attention on how to bring the dynamics that have been created in many places at the national level to the local level, and also the support for reuse, because we still need to find more innovative ways to really engage people with the data and engage the use of that data into the policy processes and the corruption prevention processes and all of that. So really finding new ways to do that, and creating or establishing more or clearer links to social and development results. I think that those are the main reflections. So with that, I finish my presentation, but we want to hear from you. So there are two questions that we would like to pose to you, and you can please add them in the chat, your responses or questions related to this or to the presentation that I just did. And also in Google Doc that we'll be sharing in the chat. So the questions are, what will you highlight as the main progress in the use of open data for anti-corruption and accountability in your context, in your experience? Please share your thoughts. And what do you think are the key challenges in which we need to invest more time, energy, and resources? And with that, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and give a space for our participants to talk. So we will start, sorry, 1 second, with Keziah Munyao, who is a research fellow at the local Development Research Institute, and she will be sharing a little bit on the global data barometer, the results, and what that means for the use of open data for anti-corruption. Keziah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Florez, for this opportunity. Well, I'd like to say, going through the discussion today, which is the evolution of open data in anti-corruption and accountability, through then since the last chapter that was produced in 2019. The Global Data Barometer analyzed 109 countries across the globe. I was able to take part and represent the Sub-Saharan Regional Hub. So I'll probably maybe be pointing out a few examples in that area. So the GDB was able to reveal an open data agenda that is still alive, but more or less it was told with a number of past open data. We see that we have quite a number of past open data leaders losing, maybe just to go back forth, still losing their leaders on losing their focus on openness, and among other countries not having strong policies. But despite that, we were able to note that 100% of the countries have open data initiatives, which was a great good deal. Going further, we've been able to, the barometer also was able to release data into the public domain in other areas, including health, environment, public finance, and political integrity, which are all these data used for the public good, which we saw they weren't able to reach, the score was 100, so most countries were above average. So for a start, I'd say that was quite a try, but we really have a lot of efforts to put in place moving forward. Thank you. I don't know if there's anything else I can add, Florez.
Yes, Keziah, you can talk more, or if you want, you can give the word to another panelist. Just let me know.
Okay, I think we can move in next. Maybe if there's something more I could that you'd want me to highlight further.
It's okay for now. I'll present another panelist. Cool. So then we have Natalia Carfi, who is the executive director of the Open Data Charter, and I have had the pleasure to work with for several years. So Natalia will be sharing more about the process of opening up information from by the governments and the work that she has done there and the challenges and trends that she sees. Natalia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jorge. Thanks, Buchiri. Thanks for the invite. It's been a pleasure to collaborate with you too, Jorge. Talking a little bit about kind of the evolution of the way that we see the evolution of this agenda coming from the chapter in State of Open Data book. So in that chapter, you actually addressed one of the tools that the Open Data Charter created, which is an open up guide on anti-corruption. In that tool, there's 30 key data sets that should be open in order for any government at any level to start an open data for anti-corruption policy. Those 30 data sets are still sound a couple of years later. But what we've been seeing a little bit, and I guess it has to do with some of the key points that you talked about a little bit, Jorge, has to do with kind of a double click into the open data for anti-corruption agenda. And with that, I mean, we are seeing that within the framework of working on anti-corruption, there is a deep dive conversation around certain topics. So the anti-corruption agenda is pretty big, and you can actually work on several things, but we are seeing a focus, of course, on open contracting, public procurement, which is kind of the most obvious, but still very, very much necessary agenda to work on. But we're also seeing a big push for land data, and we're very happy to see that both from partners that work within the open data community, but also the connections that are being made between the community that works on land issues and the community on open data. We're also seeing a push towards an agenda on open justice, which actually relates a lot to the anti-corruption agenda, mostly around commitments in OGP national action plans. So we're seeing a lot of OGP members moving towards having first commitments or second commitments, but most of them first commitments on working on open data in the judiciary power, which brings in the novelty that judiciary powers is actually talking about open data, and they can be data reusers of the data that the executive power is actually opening. So that can create a bridge towards a better data reuse of open data for anti-corruption, which is something that we need to get better on as a community. We're also seeing a couple of regional events that, conference is not, regional agreements like PIDA in Latin America, el Programa Interamericano para combatir la corrupción con datos abiertos, which is actually also creating a momentum in where there's several countries in the Latin American region working at the same time on open data and anti-corruption, and there's a lot of them that are actually including PIDA as part of their OGP national action plans. So they're making that connection between international agreements and international commitments, which makes a perfect sense. And I think I will leave it there for this first round. There's still, of course, a lot to do. A big push towards using standards that actually help interoperability, and also to actually try to tackle corruption, working aside from borders, which is the way that corruption actually works. So a big push toward data standardization that we see that it's super positive. But I'll leave it there, and then we can continue talking a little bit more.
That is good, Nati. Thank you. And I think that that's also one of the interesting findings from the Global Data Barometer, that they found out that more people are using standards for statistics and for other relevant things, and especially for things related to data for corruption. But I will now pass the word to Bence Tóth, who is a senior researcher at the Government Transparency Institute, and who has been doing a ton of work in procurement analytics and other analytics for the use of data for anti-corruption. Bence, are you there? Perfect.
Okay. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
And I'm sharing my screen, hopefully.
Yes.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm a senior researcher at the Government Transparency Institute, and we basically mostly work with public procurement data. We are collecting and analyzing it. Currently, we collect data from more than 50 countries around the globe, covering more than 100 million contracts. So that's kind of my background that will inform most of the things that I will be talking about in the next couple of slides. So just couple of main points, like on the last couple of years trend in terms of data publication. So what is kind of the consensus between us is that there is more information and in better format published on public contracting data. Not very surprising. So obviously, it's thanks to the push for advocating for data standards like OCDS and the like. And it's obviously not only for public procurement, but other domains like beneficial ownership, asset declaration. So we think that this will. So these standards are there. The momentum is there. So we expect to get a lot of more structured data coming in the next period. And maybe just one interesting thing that is kind of a byproduct of publishing this data in a standardized format is that it's not only just standardized, but what we often see is that when there is a improvement in publication practices, they also publish more data. So it's at least in procurement, we see more tenders and it's more detailed data. And maybe we can get back to that, like what sort of data is collected and published. Even that's also kind of a important question. And well, the main reason why I have this slide in the first place, though, is that besides having these good improvements, maybe just one caveat is that although governments are enthusiastically publishing new data, but it's often, it's not very stable. At least that's our experience. So they often change the way the standards that they are publishing in, or really the access routes, and that sometimes it can be tedious. So actually the cost of really getting to this data and being able to analyze or do anything with it is still kind of high-ish. And of course, there are a couple of countries where there are some step backs, like putting procurement data behind captures and stuff like that. Okay, but about use cases. So here again, the general takeaway, I think, is that using structured administrative data is really becoming mainstream in different domains. So government use civil society, or there are many data analytical startups using administrative data, at least in the field of procurement. And I would like to just highlight a couple of use cases that we think are kind of solidifying in the throughout the last couple of years. So obviously, the first use case in procurement is investigations. One of the trivial example here is the Arachna risk scoring tool. I'm not sure whether you are aware of this. This is basically a red flag tool maintained by the European Commission that connects various data sets on public procurement, company data, beneficial owners, sanctions, whatever. And it is free to use for governments, government agencies, or across Europe, and then EU institutions to find high-risk, companies in EU-funded projects. The other example is a former project of ours. It's the European Investment Bank's internal kind of analytical tool that they use for prioritizing more in-depth analysis. So basically, what they built is that they collect a lot of public procurement data across European countries, and they evaluate these contracts by their risks, so how competitive they are, how open they are. There are a bunch of dimensions that are measurable, and they connect this contract level data to the organizations they are in a contractual relationship. So these can be companies financed by the EIB or public buyers. And then this tool allows them to kind of rank high risk counterparts to be more thoroughly investigated. And the last example is actually a kind of a sub product of ours that goes under the name of TenderX, which is basically a semi-automatic report on companies or public buyers that uses public procurement data, and it allows you to understand the integrity risks of a specific supplier throughout time compared to different markets or different suppliers of the same market, or identify the highest risk transactions that a specific supplier or buyer had. So these are all kind of examples from different levels or different domains that are about investigations. And of course, the other kind of solidifying area is policy and research. So one trivial use case for procurement data is, for example, the single market scoreboard that is based on European public procurement contracts, and it lets you to compare countries, European countries, by 12 different indicators. Some of them are capturing integrity risks in contracting practices. But I could list a range of other monitoring tools, not only procurement, of course, but so for example, COVID spending. So COVID-related spending was a big trigger for putting together dashboards that are looking into high risk subcontracts or contracts that governments sign during this period. And the last bit that I wanted to say is that what we think is the biggest, or one of the biggest, or use case for this administrative big data, and especially if those are interconnected or you can connect it, is for policy research and to be able to really ask and analyze questions that were really impossible to do beforehand. So for example, we had a project recently, still partly ongoing, where we connected public procurement data with company financials and beneficial ownership and political connections data. And so this is like a very uniquely rich data set that really allows you to understand that, okay, how politically connected companies are behaving differently in public procurement markets, and how does it relate to their finances, and then basically understand, well, at least descriptively understand it better, how this whole ecosystem works. So I think, these are clearly solidified kind of use cases of this data, regardless of how good or bad the data is, and how much more work needs to be done to have even better access and in more countries better access. Okay, sorry for overrunning time. Thank you. That's all.
No worries, Bence. Thank you for the presentation. I will now give the word to Courtney Tolmie, who is the founder of Wonderlight Consulting, and who I have also been working for a while. Courtney, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Jorge, and thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel today. So I, for the last 24 months, have had the opportunity and really the pleasure to work with a number of different partners in both the research and the civil society space to work on several different research and evaluation projects related to open data, accountability, and anti-corruption, specifically within the kind of COVID space. And so as I was thinking back on those in preparation for this panel, I wanted to pull out just a few kind of high-level takeaways around the use of data for anti-corruption and accountability for the last 24 months during the pandemic. And in particular, kind of looking a little bit more about takeaways with how we measure both what's happened with open data and how it's being used, importantly. So I'm a visual learner, so I did put these on a slide. I promise this is my only slide, but just to walk through what some of those kind of high-level takeaways I think are. So first of all, there are some really positive ones. And I think that's a really good place to start, because a lot of us have spent the pandemic feeling like things just got harder and more challenging and worse. We did see some real progress that is actually measurable in the open data space. So first of all, open data creators and developers adapted very quickly and to some degree effectively, both to the changing data needs and to the way in which the world operates and the space in which they operate. So, while this may not seem revolutionary, this is absolutely a necessary, if not sufficient, condition for open data to be useful. And this was not necessarily going to be the case. As I mentioned, things got more challenging. You've heard from the other panelists, data became less consistent. It became harder to publicize that. And what we've seen through a number of studies, I think especially a project that I had the pleasure of working with Jorge and other colleagues on with Global Integrity, was that a lot of the trackers and tools that are out there for open data really adapted very quickly. They ensured that COVID-related numbers were getting in, whether that be related to procurement, spending, or other measures that were very susceptible to corruption and issues of accountability during the pandemic. And you can read more about that work on a piece that we have on the Global Integrity website. So that's the first positive. Second positive, which is really just that next step in the chain, is that we've also been able to measure and assess that activists in civil society have been able to effectively use open data to get real policy changes. Now, this hasn't been across the board. It hasn't been consistent, but there are several examples and cases that we can point to. I'll talk about one in particular that I think is really interesting to look at, and that's the case of an organization called Spaces for Change that's based in Nigeria. Spaces for Change has worked on open data around policy and regulations in particular for a long time, and has really worked on trying to get state level data, which is very challenging to get, up into the public view so that it can be used for activism. When COVID hit, they completely changed the way that they were working. And really started focusing on what were those regulations and policies that state governments and the federal government were putting into place that were making it more challenging for civic freedoms, for civil society engagement, and were really sort of cracking down on civil liberties. They posted this and continued to update a database that they have online, and they were able to really go back and see actual policy changes at the state level because the larger civil society network that they were working in could go to this open data source, could take that information, and could advocate for change. So that's just one example. There are so many we could look at, but this is one of those positive sort of measures of progress that we can look towards. And I think one reason why we're seeing that, quite honestly, is because during COVID, we did see cases where civil society organizations that have worked on anti-corruption and accountability issues for a long time had new opportunities and a new kind of impetus to work with health colleagues in ways that they hadn't before. We know that corruption has been a huge issue in the global health space for a very long time. A study in 2019 estimated that between 10 and 25% of global health spending is lost to corruption and mismanagement. Again, that's 10 to 25% of all global health spending. So this is an issue, but we also know that a lot of our colleagues working in global health haven't been as focused on this for a long time. So one of the things that we've observed with different projects that I've been working on is that there are some of these new collaborations, health colleagues that saw the sorts of corruption and accountability issues that came about with COVID and said, we want to really work more with open data colleagues to make sure that we're addressing these issues. So that's on the progress side. Now, there's also, I think, been some changes in measurement needs that we haven't necessarily totally addressed yet. And this is important as we kind of see things moving forward, because even though it does feel like we're moving to the next stage of the pandemic, you know, it's still there. And we also don't know if these types of measurement needs are going to change or if they're really going to stay in place for a long time. So first of all, we did see that there were new opportunities, if not completely new strategies for corruption that may last past the pandemic. That doesn't mean that, you know, this was a completely new area of work, but, you know, we saw things like changing election dates, much higher levels of misinformation and disinformation, and different types of problems, or at least different levels of corruption and accountability problems than we've seen before. And we haven't necessarily completely kept up with that. Which also links to the second point, which is that these changes in what's happening related to corruption and accountability also require new measures and indicators of progress, which again, we haven't completely kept up with. I've been working on a project called the Fiscal Governance Indicators Project for several years now. We started this work before COVID and, you know, got a lot of feedback from people working on economic justice and fiscal governance about the sorts of issues they were having trouble measuring. We're now revisiting those conversations with civil society partners and what they need help measuring in light of the changes to corruption and accountability with the pandemic has completely changed. They are looking more at trust, they're looking more at misinformation. And again, we haven't completely kept up with that. And then the final thing that I'll say very briefly, because I know a number of panelists have already shared this, and I would definitely agree from our experience, is that, you know, in the State of Open Data report, one of the things that the authors really highlight is that moving from availability of data to use and impact is something that has been difficult to see and difficult to measure. And I think this is a gap that remains. You've heard a number of examples already about this. So like I said, I won't share more, although happy to do that in another round, but this is a gap that we're continuing to see. And I think we really need to continue to focus on that more. So thank you.
Perfect, Courtney. Thank you. Thank you for that. So just kind of summarizing a little bit the things from the panelists. Keziah mentioned several things related to progress in open data initiatives, and the capacity for governments and interest of governments in publishing data, especially in Africa. Nati mentioned I think mentioned two things that sound, not three things that sounded really interesting to me. One was the issue about the need for, like, there are many different ways to use data for anti-corruption, and the guide that the Open Data Charter has is really useful for that. So there are still many areas to explore. Another one was the issue of commitments by governments, either at the regional level, such as the Programa Interamericano de Datos contra la Corrupción, and the issue of open justice and open justice commitments in OGP, which is a really important and interesting area to evolve in, and especially one that, for instance, Argentina has been leading the way for a while now. And Bence mentioned several things. So I really like the points that he made with examples of the analytics use and the ways that he changed the kind of or connected those analytics to making decisions for organizations to invest or finance companies, to combine data, and there are things that I would like us to come back. And also things related to policy and research, to the use of this data, not just for informing a particular decision, but for informing the progress and practice and policy in the governments. And finally, Courtney, a really good and short presentation about I think I will highlight the quick adaptation to COVID, and that's something that is important for many other things, like being prepared in case there is another pandemic, as a report by TAI and R4D that Courtney launched yesterday highlights, but also to changes in how the corruption systems work. We need to be ready for different things. So it's important that the community has that capacity to adapt. The example that she mentioned and other many examples that are there around the effective use of policy of data for achieving policy changes. And also, I think that it's really important, the change in measuring needs and the need to keep working on assessing the impact of this type of activities. And that's a really open conversation. So we will really like to hear from you more on the chat or on the Google Doc. And we're sending another question before we move up again to the panelists. So basically, in your opinion, are we missing any key issues related to the use of open data for anti-corruption from what I shared initially and what the other panelists have shared? Or do you have or disagree or have any questions or any of the points that we highlight? Now with that, we're gonna move into the second bit of the session, which is more of a conversation with the panelists about the different issues that they highlight and the things or opinions that they might have about what others share. So maybe I would like to start. Bence, can you turn on your camera and we discuss a bit more? Something that I would like to highlight is the for Keziah. When I have been looking at the global data barometer, there are definitely important results there. There are things that I have seen, and I think that this also touches on what Bence was talking about. For instance, in terms of the publication of public procurement information, the data barometer shows that only 9 countries publish the whole cycle, and in general, there is more publication, and as I think Bence mentioned, tender and awards, but not so much in terms of what's the name, planning and implementation of those contracts. And in other areas, for instance, in beneficial ownership, the barometer shows that there are good regulations or somehow strong regulations, but there is still a lot to do in terms of turning that information and turning those regulations into available data, and also available data that is not just legal ownership, but really beneficial ownership. There is still a way to go. And I think that there are issues like that in other areas. So I don't know, Keziah, anything else that you would like to highlight in terms of like specific findings that can relate to corruption, and Bence as well, anything that you would like to say about those dynamics for publication or the limits that places on use and methodologies for analysis? Keziah, you have the mic off.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I think in the area of you're mentioning about beneficial ownership, there was a little. I think it's an area of concern that would be hoping to look further into that. There was a little bit of confusion around that concept of beneficial ownership and how it differs from the legal ownership. Especially in some cases where a person can be a legal owner of a company and its beneficial owner. For example, if they are a shareholder. However, I'd just like to highlight in more complex ownership structures, the legal owner may be a company or other a legal entity. So with the beneficial owner, a different part with that, the beneficial owner might be a different person. So it's exactly in these complex structures that are of primary interest for tackling corruption and also economic and tax invasions in future. So there was quite a hitch on that. Also on public procurement, just to understand that it's critical to understand how government is spending their money and also how they are managing procurement in a way that benefits people, communities, and also businesses. So the barometer was able to highlight the critical gaps in the available data that would enable to make sure it fits and promote the availability of reuse in data in future.
Thank you, Keziah. Bence.
Yeah, so just following up on what you mentioned. So indeed, one of the bigger gaps in procurement data is that so what is happening now, or like what started to happen in the last 10 years, is that governments started to publish information in a more approachable, or like, sorry, in a more standardized and more easy to analyze way that they've already collected. And what sort of data they were collecting is basically what the law prescribed. And so this is what we are working with. And I think basically the next question is that, okay, once we have this data and basically, sorry, and what is regulated to be collected in most countries is these sort of call for tender documents that are like kind of information on how to start the process and a contract award. And basically these two documents are created in a couple of months period of a tender life cycle, whereas most public tenders are actually very last for many months or many years in a few cases. So basically what we call as like open data on public procurement, it's a very small snapshot that we see that will change very often during the implementation, because I don't know, new subcontractors will be included and the prices will increase, they will renegotiate, etc. So really the scope of the data, it will be, I think, another discussion in the coming years. I mean, it is already a discussion, of course, but I think it's like still a necessary next step, looking at actual payments and that sort of stuff. And the other thing, like I try to have a more kind of optimistic note on, or optimistic tone on how easy it is to connect different data sets. And sorry for every example coming from procurement, but yeah, there are good examples that, like, I don't know, so like company IDs, for example, that's just a very trivial. So in many countries, at least a couple of years ago, they were not really published, or even if there was some sort of ID, it was only specific to the procurement system, and it wasn't useful at all for connecting this data to other data sources. And the problem with that is that many of the data use cases are only become use cases once you can connect it to other sorts of data sets, such as beneficial ownership or sanctions data or whatnot. So maybe this, yeah, these are my quick reflections on it.
Perfect, Vincent. No, and thanks for that. But you finished your intervention with something that is really interesting and has always been interesting to me, and it's the connection of data sets to kind of do the part that I was mentioning in the trends about giving context to the story, giving context to investigation, and being able, as you also mentioned, asking further questions that we had not even thought about before. So in that sense, you mentioned an investigation that you and your colleagues were doing, combining several things like procurement, company financials, beneficial ownership, and political connections. So it will be good to if you can share a little bit on how doing that work is, and if it has changed recently, and if you have had any findings. And but also to kind of also connect to that conversation, I would like to ask you, Nati, about what you are seeing in terms of the actual practice of the governments to try to open this information. You know that in the Open Data Charter, you guys have supported, for instance, Mexico and Ecuador recently to implement like most of the things in the guide that you have for open data for anti-corruption, and the commitment in the PIDA commitment in Latin America. So can you also share a little bit more with us about that? Yeah, how that process is, what challenges are they facing, what things are you seeing that are important and that we should pay attention? And yeah, please feel free, either of you, to start.
One of the key things that we found, which was not like something that we weren't going to find, is as anti-corruption is it's a horizontal policy. There's always kind of a one office that leads the anti-corruption policy, but you need to work horizontally across different agencies and ministries. So one of the main findings that we did when implementing the Open Up Guide in different countries, and we did it in Ecuador, in Mexico, but also in Uzbekistan, which you might think it's super different, but once you get started, you find that challenges are similar. One of the things that we found out is it's not just about the data, it's also about connecting the people. So we started with kind of a small internal joke about creating people interoperability. And now it has gone beyond the joke. It's actually a thing that we work on. So through the work that we've been doing in implementing these Open Up Guides, we have been able to create, sometimes for the first time, these conversations through different areas of governments that need to collaborate in order to actually create better data, publish better data, or even to reuse each other's data. We found out in certain countries that there were two areas of government creating the same types of data, and they didn't know about it. So it's very important not to talk just about kind of the technical bit of it, the data bit of it, but also kind of the institutional collaboration bit of any open data policy. And then one of the other key findings that we found, sorry for using that word again, but it also has to do with including data literacy as part of the open data policy. So if we don't promote data literacy inside of government, but also outside of government, we're going to keep publishing data that is not going to kind of uphold to be totally unlocked its public value. You know, we always talk about locked public value when data is not being open. In order to unlock actually that public value, we need to promote also data literacy. It's not just about promoting data reuse. It's like a step back from that, a middle step in between data publication and data reuse, which has to do with data literacy. So any integral open data for anti-corruption policy needs to have a data literacy component built into it from the get-go. And I guess I'll leave it there. So it's people's interoperability and data literacy as one of the main findings that we did while implementing Open Up Guides around the globe.
Thank you, Nati. Really good points. Bence.
Yeah, just a +1 to data literacy. I think this is like a very often underrated problem that, you know, you can publish whatever data, but like you have to be able to find the people who will actually understand what it means, and that's not very trivial. And I think this is actually one of the potentially key factors that you know, slow down take up of data use quite often, especially in government. Like you know, we expect people to do data analytical work that they're really not equipped to do that at all. So yeah, just a +1 to that. And yeah, so I cannot name the country yet, but basically what we were because it's like still a work in progress. But what we were focusing on several things. And maybe just one example that we looked at how COVID spending, or like the more relaxed rules that were introduced in contracting due to COVID, that actually affected not only COVID-specific products, but other markets as well, often just indirectly, but it did. So how these risks evolved in the last 2 years. So one interesting takeaway was that that obviously all markets increased their risks. So by risks, I mean like higher probability of single bidder contracts, higher share of of contracts with extremely short advertisement period, invitation-only contracts and the like, and this is completely fine, of course, in the beginning of this whole period. But what was interesting, I think, is that okay, we would expect to observe this kind of more risky contracting patterns for a couple of months, but it's been 2 years, and what happened in many countries, and in this one that we looked at in detail in particular, is that the risks remained quite high. So the risk that contracting is happening 2 years from the beginning of this pandemic and the introduction of more relaxed rules are still higher than pre-pandemic, which is quite a interesting thing to see. And just one specific pattern that we found by connecting procurement to company data is that we find higher share of companies whose activity, like the I don't know how they say, like the activity code from the company register is completely random compared to what sort of high-risk tenders they are winning on public contracts. So basically, you find companies winning high-risk contracts oddly because they are not from the same market. So, you know, it sounds like a very, I mean, I don't know, trivial finding, but like you wouldn't be able to see this, and you know, this is actually sort of actionable because it means that public buyers would be able to see that the suppliers or like a monitoring agency would see that the suppliers awarded, I don't know, healthcare contracts are, by the way, I don't know, selling fax machines or what fax machines. Okay, not anymore fax machines, but like whatever IT supplies. Okay, yeah, so that's it.
Perfect, thank you, Bence. Yeah, no, and definitely those kind of efforts to combine things provide more context to investigation that you're doing. Like the data point is a lead, but then you need to build the rest and to understand the rest of things. And well, for instance, I think that the indicators that you guys have been developing are really useful for identifying things, but then you need to go deeper, to go wider, and to understand how that is happening. And it's good to hear that you're making progress on that. But you also mentioned something that connects quite well to what Courtney was mentioning, and is that the risks that emerged from the pandemic are still there, even if the hard part of the pandemic already passed, but the things remain. So with that cue, I would like to ask Courtney to share maybe a bit more about those things. Like one is the kind of the trends that we're seeing on things that are remaining after the pandemic, the good or the bad ones. So what did the pandemic change and what is still happening there? And the other one will be maybe a little bit more on conversations or talks that you have or are seeing in relation to measuring progress and impact. So please, Courtney.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think the bad news is that I do think a lot of these problematic policies have remained. Absolutely agree with what Bence shared about procurement issues. You know, while some countries have shifted back to kind of a non-emergency setting, there are a lot of problematic policies that were put in place in an emergency setting that really have not reversed. And I think from a sort of measurement and evaluation standpoint, one of the things that we haven't done on the evaluation side that I would like to see more of and hope to be more involved in is to understand whether or not kind of the adaptations that the open data community implemented around those emergency settings are now being able to be used. So, you heard a lot during the early stages of COVID about keep the receipts. So, our community recognizing that, okay, things do have to be done differently, but that doesn't mean we have to lose accountability in that process. And so, what we saw was a lot of adaptations where, it was harder to get data. The data looked very different, but there was at least publication to say, we're going to go back and look at these receipts later, to see whether or not there were problematic decisions, and then we can kind of hold those people to account later. I haven't seen a lot of studies that have gone back and looked and said, well, did that happen? Did people use this? And I could be wrong, maybe they're out there, but I do think that's something we need to see more of. So I think there are some problematic procurement policies that have remained in place. I think there's also some problematic regulations. While we have seen countries changing a number of their policies related to public health measures, there are still some of those longstanding things related to putting restrictions on civil liberties that don't make sense anymore, given where we are in the pandemic, and that are still in place. So I do think that there are those kind of issues. On the positive side, I will say that we are seeing some changes in terms of how activists and civil society are using the data that is out there. I would like to see more of that coming to the surface. So, one of the things, and Jorge, you can speak to this as well as I can, we are currently in the process of doing this follow-up to this COVID tracker research that we did about a year ago to see how COVID trackers adapted as vaccines became available and kind of the issues of corruption related to COVID changed. And I think what we've seen is that there are some really positive use cases, cases of corruption that journalists are identifying, that civil society is identifying, and that are being brought up to push back and to see changes. Those are not as public as we had hoped. I agree with the statements that Nadi made in particular on data literacy, but I think it's not just data literacy. I think it's also kind of publicizing information about how people are using open data to achieve accountability, because I think that there are a lot more people that could get involved in that if they knew some of these positive cases, some of these examples of how to do it. So, that's a little bit more of a kind of pessimistic view, but also, hopefully a few kind of points where we could do more about making this information public to really inspire more of this sort of activism around open data.
Perfect, Courtney, thank you. And yes, I'm just thinking about that research that we're just finishing with the Transparency and Accountability Initiative, and how we're seeing that, yeah, capacity is definitely important. It's something that needs work, but there also needs to be, and that's why one of the takeaways in my first presentation was, we need to rethink about how to promote the use of data, because you can have capacities, but you need a lot more than capacities to really be interested, motivated, and have the space to use the data. So I don't know, I would like to hear from any of you about your experience of either successfully using, seeing people successfully using data and what you think was relevant there, or for you in your own work, or I don't know, ideas or talks about what could be relevant for rethinking or advancing the ways that we try to promote the use of the data. So please, the floor is for all of yours, all of you. No volunteers? I will volunteer one of you.
Hi, Jorge. Hi. I think maybe just what from the discussion that was previously on building capacity, especially for government, that is something that we really quite notice. There's still a lot to be done in building capacities of governments where the civil service are, especially refer this back to mostly in the African government. So it's really a concern, especially on data and digitization. So for countries, I think there's really a need to secure and provide greater resources to deliver capacity development and institutional strengthening, especially in our national statistic offices, which are the ones that really provide this data, which are really an important driving force behind our national open data projects.
Thank you, Keziah. Nati, Bence, Courtney, any thoughts?
So when we worked together with Jorge, we were working on open data for anti-corruption commitments within national action plans within OGP. So we will be monitoring what came out of that, because the commitments that we're creating using the tools that we developed together are just being implemented, and that is something that we want to see. We were trying to tackle the issue of the problems not being defined enough and the activities not being kind of related to the objectives that the OGP commitments were supposed to address. And so we created together with Global Integrity, with ILDA, with the African Open Data Network, and Muchiri also here. It was a consortium of organizations that actually created these tools to make better open data for anti-corruption commitments. But that project ended in the last couple of months of last year. So we will be looking forward to the implementation of the commitments that use these tools. So in the next round of calls about it, I hope I have something new to share about it.
Thank you, Nati. Bence, Courtney.
I mean, I can share one case from the research that we've been doing together from South Africa, and in particular this tracker called Keep the Receipts, so looking at procurement data related to COVID, that was developed by the Public Service Accountability Monitor and Open Up. You know, I think based on interviews we've had with them and reviewing the tracker itself, I mean, I think we've seen that there are some positive use cases where media outlets or civil society organizations have been able to come in and use that data and make some noise, you know, get it out in the public that there are these gaps in the data and gaps that suggest that there may be corruption. I think, though, the thing to really acknowledge there is that's really hard. So, you know, you have the Public Service Accountability Monitor and Open Up that developed this program that has its own challenges. I mean, in terms of getting data in any sort of consistent and cohesive way from the government, they're putting it up there as much as they can, but it's hard. And then to also kind of be able to set aside resources from their budgets, from their work, to, you know, respond to people who are coming to them and saying, well, we want to use this data, but we're not sure how, or can you get things up more consistently, or can you share it in a different way? And so, you know, there are those positive cases, but I think we can't overlook, and we've talked about this already, data literacy, capacity, and the resources to recognize that just putting it up there, while that's a huge step in and of itself, that's not enough. And so I think one of the reasons why they've been able to have some success is that in getting to use and potentially impact is that they have dedicated resources to responding to requests for more information, responding to requests of how can we use this. But I think that it's important to acknowledge that's not it's not a resource-free endeavor. And I think sometimes there are not enough resources put into that step, going beyond opening data to kind of using impact.
Thank you, Courtney. Bence?
Yeah, so maybe just so we also maintain a website where we publish data that we collect on European countries. It's the opentender.eu, and so indeed we are kind of trying to give it a facelift, sort of, and indeed, so despite spending really many years, like 6-7 years, with public procurement data, and I think we have a pretty good understanding of what is the data that we have there and like how to interpret it. It's still very hard and like on a daily basis to figure out like how to display it in a way that is really digestible and it's as truthful as it can be, because even being aware of the fact that we just see a snapshot. So yeah, I would just like connect to the point that it's one thing that you have a structured nice data set, and it's a very entirely different step, or like largely different step to be able to display it or tell a story with it that is meaningful. It reflects the truth, sort of, and understandable for a wider community, or like a wider set of people, not only procurement experts. And maybe one interesting point is that so this website is used by quite a wide range of people. So obviously many investigative journalists were using it. Public buyers can check out the suppliers that we have data for, and also it's very often companies reaching out to us asking like whether they can find new opportunities there, and like whether they can check their competitors more thoroughly. So the same data, but so diverse set of use cases emerge just from one platform. Like it's interesting to see that the same thing can be used very differently by different people.
Thank you, Bence. Great. So we're coming close to the end of the roundtable, but I will share an example. But while I'm sharing it, I would like to give you some time to think about like 3 things that you will prioritize moving forward, like 3 key issues that need to be addressed moving forward, and that you think would be useful to highlight in the update to the State of Open Data chapter. And while you guys think a little bit about that, I want to share some of our findings from work in Nigeria and Colombia with organizations trying to promote the use of data for different things, for procurement, for tracing illicit assets, for extractive industries, for the implementation of projects funded by extractive industries resources. Those organizations were the Public-Private Development Center, Human Environmental Development Agenda in Nigeria, Transparencia por Colombia, and Acuadabra, which is an indigenous organization in Colombia. One of the main things that we saw is that a really important thing, but it's really hard to do, and it kind of connects to what Bence was saying about the kind of many different types of use cases that can come up from a data set, from opening it up, or from making it more accessible to people, is that what we saw is that there was more success in really getting the partners or the people in government to use the data set or the data, or to care about the data, when the way to engage them started from understanding how they operated, the priorities that they had, and the kind of goals in their organizations and in their roles. So kind of try to, rather than saying, here's the data, you can use it for this and this way, more trying to understand, so this person will need to, I don't know, improve the inclusion of youth people in his municipality. So how can they use this data for that? So bringing the data to the problems and then seeing how those things relate was something really useful for promoting the use of data. And I think that that's a hint into some of the things that we need to do, either in promoting the use of data by government and increasing their capacities, because that will also kind of engage them more and make more sense for them to get the capacities, as well as for civil society. And also, I think that helping us connect this anti-corruption conversation to many specific results, for instance, results in inclusion. How is corruption affecting the inclusion of youth, of women, or LGBTQ communities, and not just telling that story, but also seeing how the data can be used for the kind of transformational changes in policy that Courtney was mentioning, or in decision making that Bence was mentioning. So I think that that's an important way to go, and something that we should try to pay more attention to. But with that, and to not take a ton of time from the audience after this, I will give you guys the word to just give your final takeaways. So who wants to start?
So I will go ahead. What I do think kind of a new chapter of state of open data and open data for anti-corruption should address is this idea that you talked about, and I kind of backed a little bit more, about how within the anti-corruption agenda, we are seeing kind of a double click or a deep dive into certain topics. So of course, public procurement, but land management being one of them. I would also address open justice, because I think it will kind of make the connection about anti-corruption data being used by judiciary powers. So I would definitely put that in. And then the data literacy component, specifically for using data for anti-corruption. Those are kind of the two things that I would address if we were writing a second chapter together.
Thank you, Nati. Who else wants to jump?
Maybe I can. So just as 15 minutes ago, I again would just connect to the data literacy point. And the other is a bit technical about data, making sure that data quality, documentation, and interoperability of open data sets are ensured. And maybe the third point would be, for me, is not only focusing on making something open, but re-examine what data exactly we need and for what purpose, because I think that sometimes it's just getting in the background. Yeah, these would be my 3 points.
Thank you, Bence. Courtney, Keziah.
Well, I can jump in. So I agree with everything that's been said so far. I mean, I will say, I feel like there has been so much advancement over the last, decade and more on the technical side of things, just the availability of data. So I would definitely focus my three things on use. And so I think we need to understand so much more on incentives for use of open data. I think that's a piece, and it's come out a little bit in this discussion, the issue of political will, also the incentives for not using or not opening up data. So I think better understanding of that, understanding of the strategies for use. I think what we have right now still feels like a lot of anecdotes. And I think having a more cohesive understanding of like where the trends are about what works and what doesn't in different contexts. And then finally, I think just amplifying the message of use. Like I said, there are these anecdotes, but even those are not always making it out into the public as much. And I really believe that if they did, there would be more people who would say, oh, that's a great idea. I can do this in my context. I can do that in my country. It's not always this intensive process. Sometimes it really is kind of small changes that make a difference. And I think part of the problem is we just haven't been amplifying those stories of use. So use, and use.
Perfect, Courtney. I really agree with that. Keziah.
Okay, I'd like to deep further into the accountability mechanisms, especially in the areas of that shows distribution of public resources, especially in the areas of public procurement. And further, also I'd like to look at partnerships, which are critical for support and resourcing for data availability, and also promoting change in the government offices. Thank you.
Thank you, Keziah. The last one was changes in government, right? Just taking notes. Cool. So thank you all. I will give the word to Muchiri, who will have a final words for the session. But I would like to thank all the people that participated in the event, as participants or have been watching us in YouTube. So just flag that this is an open conversation. If you want to add anything, send ideas, you can reach out to the Twitter channels that we have been using, or you can reach out to us. And yeah, thank you all. Thank you to you all for all your contributions and ideas. And yeah, Muchiri, the word is for you.
Thank you, Jorge, for helping lead this panel. Thank you, Courtney, Nati, Keziah, and Bence for being here today, taking time to delve into this issue of open data and anti-corruption. And thank you for your ideas, your insights. And I'm pretty certain a lot of this will help drive the direction in which we take this chapter. Jorge's taken notes, he's inspired, he couldn't stop writing, so that's really great. Gotten some input. I've seen some comments on the chat, and I saw someone putting some thoughts on the document that we put up, the Google Doc, and we'll keep these channels of communication open, even on the other side of this session. As I said, this was live streamed. It's live streamed. It's recorded, and it's available on the d4d.net YouTube channel. So if you know anyone who would benefit from being part of this conversation, who wasn't able to join us today, please do send them the link. Encourage them to watch it. Encourage them to jump in and add their comments, their thoughts on the chat and the comment section on our YouTube channel. And all this content, all these ideas, all these thoughts shall be added, shall be aggregated and then provided to the chapter author Jorge as he puts this together. So we really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you for being part of this first inaugural 5-set roundtable series of State of Open Data. And we look forward to the revised chapter and your new perspectives. If you put out anything, please do let us know. We'd love to amplify it. If you write any blog posts or any essays around this, we'd really like to put them up there and continue driving this conversation. Yeah, so I think that brings us to the end of our week. The penultimate roundtable was this one on anti-corruption, and I'm hoping that as we prepare for the next round of roundtables, which we shall announce, fairly in the coming days, in the coming months, we shall have this level of engagement and more from everyone. We've also come to the end of the week, so this is a good time for me to say, have yourselves a lovely weekend and an exciting end of day, whatever your day is and whatever is left of it. My name is Muchiri Nyaga. Have a fantastic time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.